I'm happy to welcome you on behalf of all of the organizers, as the conference is part of a broader program of the meetings of the ENICPA network, that is the European Network of the Information Centers for Performing Arts. The annual meeting this year is taking place in Warsaw, and Zbigniewa Raszewskiego Theatre Institute has the pleasure to collaborate on the preparations of this event with ITI Germany and with Zachętą Gallery. And we hope for a common discussion around the topic of mobility and aesthetics, together with all the members of the ENICPA network that are present here, the representatives of different cultural institutions from various countries that came to Warsaw. We also wanted to invite special guests. We are pleased that we can welcome them, and we also announced an open call. We are really happy that speakers that are interested in this topic came, and we wanted to invite you to join the discussion. We hope it will be open, and yes, and I give the floor to Christine.
Right. Also, welcome from our part. My name is Christine from the International Theatre Institute in Germany. As editor said already, we were also cooperating in this project. In our case, it is that we cooperated in the frame of our project, Passage 23, Theatre and Theatricality from the Baltic to the Aegean, which is a project which deals with information and knowledge exchange on theatre developments in the countries of Central, Central Eastern and Southeastern Europe. So you will see during the conference that there is some strong focus on that here. I'd like now to head over the microphone to our first and foremost keynote speaker, Professor Günther Heeg. He's professor in theater studies and the director of the Center for Competence of the Center for Competence of Competence for Theater. I'm very sorry. It's such a long name, which is CCT, which is situated at the University in Leipzig in Germany. Thank you.
So, wie komme ich zum Ding? Komme ich zum Okay, thank you. Hello. A warm welcome also from my side. And thank you so much for the invitation to come to Warsaw. I'm very pleased to be here and to talk to you today. The title of my lecture will be The Raft of the Medusa, Mobility, Instability, and the Idea of Transcultural Theater. My talk consists in 3 parts, I will tell you. At full speed and without support is the first part. Second, aesthetics of transit existence, elements of a transcultural theater. And the third part will be theater for all and by all. And we will immediately start with the first part, at full speed and without support. 1939, Svendborg, Denmark. In exile, Bertolt Brecht writes the play The Life of Galilei. In it, 3 texts take different positions on the challenge of a new era, which we could call globalization. First, there is Galileo's explanation of the new Copernican worldview. It paints a world completely in motion and culminates in a sentence, The old idea was always that the stars were fixed to a crystal vault to stop them falling down. Today we have found the courage to let them soar through space without support. And they are traveling at full speed and without support, just as we do, at full speed and without support. The instability, the experience of groundlessness, which is expressed here, is praised by Galilei. At full speed and without support, this means progress. Galilei regards instability in motion as liberation from the hierarchical authoritarian order of the Ptolemaic worldview and its social counterpart, the feudal state order. The little monk, whose position is also expressed in Brecht's play, sees things rather differently. My parents were peasants in the Campagna, and I grew up there. They are simple people. They knew all about olive trees, but not much else. They are badly off, but even their misfortunes imply a certain order. They have been assured that God's eye is always on them, probingly, even anxiously, that the whole drama of the world is constructed around them so that they, the performers, may prove themselves in their greater or lesser roles. What would my people say if I told them that they happen to be on a small knob of stone twisting endlessly through the void around a second-rate star, just one among myriads? The randomness and superfluousness of such an existence like a rolling stone, as Bob Dylan calls it, is difficult to endure. It is therefore easy to give in to the pullback into the security and comfort of the world as seen from the Ptolemaic point of view. Its promise of happiness is formulated in the life of Galilei by the very old cardinal. I am not just any old creature on any insignificant star, briefly circling in no particular place. I am walking with a firm step on a fixed earth. It is motionless. It is the center of the universe. I am the center. And the eye of the Creator falls upon me and me alone. Round about me, attached to 8 crystal spheres, revolve the fixed stars and a mighty sun, which has been created to light my surroundings, and myself too, that God may say me, the mankind, God's great effort, the creature on whom it all centers, made in God's own image, indestructible. Here, by combining the Ptolemaic worldview with the metaphor of the Theatrum Mundi, the world is turned into a Ptolemaic stage, which perfectly serves to the old theatrical longing to play the lead, thus to stand in the center of everything, to be the protagonist in the spotlight of the stars, complacently viewed upon and securely led by the heavenly figure of the author and director. That's what the Ptolemaic perspective promises. Although we live in times in motion, the longing for the world to be set up as a Ptolemaic stage is still virulent today. Its means are the predominance of author, drama, director, and continuous narrative over theater, the embodiment of the meaning of dramatic action by the actors, and the penetration of all material and physical through the logos, of the godlike author and director. The Ptolemaic stage presents a world full of meaning, a place where everything makes sense, a world in standstill. Captivated and immobilized by the conventions of the 19th and 20th century, immobility of aesthetics, aesthetic of immobility. Imagine a theater which would incorporate the Copernican revolution. What would it look like? A theater and an aesthetic of a theater in motion. 2018, Warsaw. The mobility of aesthetics are a reflection of and a response to a process of fundamental social mobility in times of globalization. Predominantly involuntarily, people are moved, or rather dislocated, by means of economic pressure, social marginalization, and political persecution. People in Germany and Europe are forced to leave their habitations, not to speak of homes, in order to find employment, in order to get a job and to keep it. As Richard Sennett has pointed out, one has to be a flexible person who is willing to keep moving and who is able to adapt to any new place and situation. This inner capitalist mobility is reflected by the migratory movements of those who are escaping from civil war, social and ethnic marginalization or political persecution, causes which altogether originate to a great extent in the battles for resources and in the asymmetries of the globalized chaos which seemingly has been accepted to serve as a world order. Along with people, cultures are in motion and get carried around the globe. Cultural practices of different origins suddenly find themselves brought into a confusing mixture in one and the same place. All this makes clear the forms of mobility which at the moment determine our lives are neither designed to nor able to make people feel secure and to give them confidence in the future. Disorientation and fear caused by cultural hybridization, socio-economical precarization, and a feeling of complete instability are the reactions towards mobility of humans and cultures in the era of globalization. Disorientation, fear, precarization, and instability are the breeding ground for fundamentalist movements worldwide. They want to rebuild all the borders, economical, social, and cultural. They want to erect walls to prevent mobility. Their aim is to withdraw into a retrotopia, as Zygmunt Bauman called it, the heartland of an imaginary original community that is ethnically pure, socially homogeneous, and culturally identical. Such fundamentalist movements can take place on the streets or in a coalition with right-wing parliamentarian parties, as is the case in Germany. They can also already have gained power and from there restructure the state and society. Not only the United States, but also some states of Eastern Europe are good examples of this. The ominous dialectic of global mobility and fundamentalist counter-movement. This ominous dialectic marks the historical setup in which we, theater makers, scientists, mediators are moving. This dialectic is the prerequisite for a border-crossing mobility of aesthetics. The networks and collaborations which we aim for and which we build are essential steps on the way towards a mobilization of the arts and of artistic concepts. Building networks and collaboration are essentially important with those countries which are under fundamentalist reign in order to strengthen opposing forces. But mobility of aesthetics is not enough. It will remain on the surface if it is not supported and inspired by an inherent aesthetic of mobility. The motion which this aesthetic follows is that of a life in transit, that of a transit existence. Second part. Aesthetics of transit existence, elements of a transcultural theater. 1819, Paris. Theodore Géricault's painting, The Raft of the Medusa, is based on an actual ship disaster. The sinking of the frigate Medusa with early 400 dead, a scandal in the naval ministry which led to the dismissal of the minister and of 200 officers. The motive quickly became a metaphor for a life as a precarious, turbulent journey without a foothold, without solid ground under one's feet, without a native shore or a saving port. Beyond the pathos of the representation, Géricault's painting appears as a premonition of images we are confronted with these days, of those of barely seaworthy boats with refugees on board. The ones on the raft of the Medusa are an early testimony of what I call a transit existence. In 1943, New York, the German philosopher Hannah Arendt, who as a Jew had to flee from Germany, writes her famous essay, We Refugees. Arendt describes the existence of a refugee as that of an outlawed pariah who lives in a permanent in-between of departure and arrival. She equally refuses to look back regressively or to assimilate in the future. For those glorifying the past, she tells a tale of the forlorn émigré Dachshund, Dackel, who in his grief begins to speak, once when I was a St. Bernard. For those hungry for assimilation, she tells the story of that Mr. Kohn from Berlin, who had always been a 150% German, a German super patriot. In 1933, that Mr. Kohn found refuge in Prague and very quickly became a convinced Czech patriot until 1937, when he was chased away by the Czech government and went to Vienna, where, to adjust himself, he paid homage to Austrian patriotism for a short time until he was forced to escape to Paris and to become a real French man. I think I had better not dilate on the further adventures of Mr. Kohn. Arendt concludes this spectacle. According to Arendt, the wish to return to an idealized homeland as it materializes in parallel societies is not appropriate to the reality of a world characterized by flight and by creation. Neither is the easy adjustment to the new whereabouts of an existence on escape. The history of those on the move is extinguished as they make themselves at home nowhere and everywhere at the same time. To live indiscriminately, facelessly, and without traces of history in a ubiquitous here and now is the ideal which is promoted by the propagandists of globalization. In view of the phantasmatic character of both attitudes, Arendt rejects both the regressive transfiguration of the past and the flexible adaptation to any new place and any new situation. Though hardly bearable, the life of the refugees and migrants preconfigurate an idea of a transit existence as a form of life to come. A form of life which is shaped by the experience of the foreign, a past which has become alien, a future in a strange surrounding, and that aims to transform this experience into something positive. In this sense, Arendt comes to the surprising conclusion: refugees, driven from country to country, represent the vanguard of their peoples. She appoints the status of the refugee a utopian reference potential. Contrary to current reality, Arendt sees the transit existence of refugees and migrants as the pre-experience of a way of life that is about to arrive. It is time for the idea of a transit existence, as it goes beyond the concepts of origin and telos, the defining characteristics of the fiction of a coherent life story. It is time, as this idea exposes the phantasma of fundamentalist original forces, such as religion, nation, ethnicity, race, and cultural identity, which we can see returning with new momentum and irreconcilable hatred for everything foreign. It is about time for this idea, as it is the basic condition for a cohabitation among strangers. Only those who have distanced themselves from their environment of origin without denying their history, those who look at the culture of their origins from a perspective of a foreigner, will be capable of living together among strangers. Eventually, it is the time for the idea of a transit existence as it prepares the ground for a transcultural theater practice in a migration society, for the configuration and elaboration of which all refugees as well as natives can participate in. What characterizes the idea of transcultural theater? As a basic principle, it does not assume the existence of singular and closed cultures as a whole, which it aims to bring in contact with each other. It rather starts with experiences of the foreign and strangeness in one's supposedly very own so-called national culture. The alien, passing through the supposedly very own of culture, a certain transmotion which crosses the alleged security of what one considers to be one's own culture, is the motive of transcultural theater. Free essential elements come into constellation in the idea of a transcultural theater. The urgency of a theater among strangers, the necessity of a theater of iteration, and the moving force of a theater of gesture. First element, theater among strangers. Transcultural theater is a decisive medium for the orientation towards the foreign. But it does not seek the foreign in the distance, in other countries, exotic cultures, but first and foremost within what is regarded as one's very own cosmos, which it lets appear in an unfamiliar light. Only if the border between what is considered one's own and what seems to be the other's is challenged, and only if what seems to be one's very own has become alien, a free approach towards the foreign, that of oneself and that of the others, will be possible. The foreigner is not something you could point your finger at. Refugees, migrants, and post-migrants are not foreigners in this sense. If they are regarded as such, they are simply turned into something exotic. Wherever the theater sets out in search of the foreign, it is crucial that it does not create or reproduce exotisms, that it does not presumptuously speak on behalf of the others, and that it does not fall back into dramaturgies of opposition that allow the obsolete friend-enemy scheme of political action to recur, not even in a struggle for a supposedly good cause. Transcultural theater creates space for experience. It leaves no room for identity politics. The foreign is not a thing, the stranger not a subject. Strangeness is an experience which occurs to us. It alienates our perception of the foreign in such a way that our perception becomes foreign to us. It is the experience of a foreignness within ourselves. Only on the ground of this experience, living together in a transcultural world becomes possible. Therefore, theater of strangers is not simply made by and made for so-called strangers from outside, but also for the strangers that we are. It is a theater among strangers, a theater among transit existences, the kind of theater that takes place on a raft of the Medusa. However, transcultural theater, as well as the idea of transit existence, is fundamentally different from the reality of those escaping on small rafts and boats then and today. Transcultural theater takes up the struggle for bare life in transit, but it does not seek to represent it on the scene. It refuses any form of realism that seeks to reproduce reality as it supposedly is, and thus to enlighten humanity about the state of the world. Transcultural theater draws on the reality of life in transit and transforms it into the experience of a possibly different transit existence as a form of life to come. It does not turn its gaze away from the horrors of reality, but takes them up transformingly in order to propose ways back into the realm of life. 2017 Bautzen in Saxonia. The performances, which were created and presented in the context of the festival Willkommen Anderswo, sich spielend begegnen, may be translated as welcome elsewhere, meeting playfully, are a good example for felicitous transcultural theater work. The performances were made by and in collaboration with both refugees and locals. Almost throughout, they brought newcomers and locals together into play. If the original dramaturgy of a text asked for two rivaling groups, as was the case for the Bautzen production of Romeo and Julia of Platte, Romeo and Juliet, the groups were represented by young refugees and locals alike. The line of confrontation, along with the groups of the Montagus and the Capulets, had competed, was literally danced away. Thus, the frights of cultural identity and confrontation were not concealed, but rather clearly spelled out. And however, at the same time, the dancing bodies freed themselves from the constraints of confrontation. We'll show you some pictures of this production. Here you can see the two groups and a red line of confrontation between them, and then the struggle, the battle along this red line, the confrontation, and the dancing away also. Also, the other productions of the festival did not center around cultural identities. They rather concentrated on shared fears, hopes, and expectations. No longer did a specific group of people play the role of the protagonist or was subject of the theater. The productions did not show a theater of refugees, migrants or post-migrants, but rather a theater among strangers. Those strangers, new arrivals and locals, are united by the stories they tell each other. They emphasize the need for a theater of iteration on the raft of the Medusa. Second element, theater of iteration. History holds the potential of resistance and future, which transcultural theater brings into position against the defensive castles of fundamentalism, as well as against the leveling of all different life worlds by the dynamics of globalization. The figure of iteration is therefore central for the perspective of a transcultural theater. It is fundamentally different from a desire for restoration of supposedly original circumstances. Iteration does not refer to an origin or an original. It does not repeat in order to restore, but rather to bring the remains of history in contact with the present. Conscious iteration of history, a history conscious of its non-originality, corrodes the phantasm of a homogeneous community of essence and identity. Collective phantasms such as the Western world, the Christian Abendland, national cultures, the imagination of America first and Germany for Germans, are based on obscure myths of origin, constructions of history, overcome traditions, and commemorative rituals which ban history into a standstill. The theatrical practice of iteration destroys the alleged cultural unity and integrity of these constructions and seeks to preserve the remains of history by transferring them into different times and context, therefore opening history for transcultural discussion. The stories that were told on the raft of Medusa at the festival in Bautzen are examples for such a practice of the iteration of history. For it was not the immobilized original history of different cultures, this is the Orient, this is the Occident, which was presented there, but the discontinuous histories of individuals. These stories are cut, both from their origin and from their current location. The border no longer runs between one's own and the foreign, but crosses right through the self. The current state of the migration society invites us to distance ourselves from the supposed familiarity of one's own history and to look at it from an altered perspective. At the same time, the fragments of one's own life story, carried into what's here and now, alter the view of the present. Such stories of multiple border crossings between origin and current situation, past and present, familiar and foreign, self and other, are open and connectable to the stories of others. They are different and alien to themselves and to the other, while at the same time they feel close and familiar precisely through the shared experience of alienation. Third element, theater of gestures. The agent of transcultural transgression is the gesture. For Benjamin and Brecht, gestures originate in interruption. Quote, gestures, the more often we interrupt an actor, the more we receive them, is Benjamin's famous explanation of Brecht's gesture. According to Benjamin, gestures are essentially defined by two characteristics. They can be fixated and they can be cited. Precisely their citability is what enables them to depart from any accustomed context of life and to open up new possibilities for action. It is a departure into foreign regions and surroundings. Gesture is a migrant par excellence. This is not metaphorically speaking, but referring to Brecht, the result of a painful experience. In a peculiar relationship of continuity and discontinuity, the gesture connects one's own past, which has become alien, with an uncertain future in a foreign place. The gesture is therefore a paradigmatic, a paradigmatic medium of transcultural communication. Gestural communication is that of strangers who have given up their attachment to a cultural tradition and community. At the same time, however, they acknowledge their differences by the recognition of certain fragments of memories and the past which remain present in their gestical citations. Gestures are abundant history. At the same time, they are open and connectable to new history, to new histories, in constellation with different geographic contexts and times. Last part, theater for all and by all. Berlin, end of the 1920s. Transcultural theater is also a cultural practice for and by all. Brecht has developed a model for such a theater, the Lehrstück, the learning play. Contrary to what the name suggests, it does not impart any concrete teaching, but is meant to enable learning through the experience of theater. The Lehrstück opens up a space of experience in which those involved can perceive themselves as strangers. The Lehrstück mediates the experience of playing among strangers with the aim to distance oneself from oneself in interaction with others. Brecht particularly emphasized the importance of this moving away from oneself. Quote, players and spectators should not get close to each other. Rather, they should move away from each other. everyone should move away from oneself. Otherwise, the horror that is necessary for recognition will disappear. The practice of the Lehrstück could be described as playing with strangers, or better, playing strangers. One of its rules is that the players exchange roles in order to be able to put themselves in the position of the other, that they imitate, even copy the gestures of the others in order to experience the attitudes and feelings associated with them, and the differences between copy and what is copied. Another part of the practice of the Lehrstück is that the role of the Spielleiter, who determines the arrangement of the scenic experiment, changes constantly. Thus, new courses for the play can be set into action. And last but not least, the role of the participants alternates between playing and observing. They are actors and spectators at the same time. The Lehrstück, understood as a transcultural theater for all and by all, makes it possible to perceive oneself as a stranger in an adaptation, of roles, texts, rhythms, and forms of movement, and to experience what makes one afraid and what one desires. And this can happen without the threat of immediate danger, because the sanctions, the imagined and the real ones of everyday life, are set aside in this particular space, which is characterized by its peculiar connection of fiction and reality. In this space, fears, particularly the fear of strangers, can literally be put at risk and brought into play. Bringing into play means no position, no attitude remains what it used to be. To bring into motion what was solid and the desire to move without ground while learning not to give in to the desire to recreate stability is the ultimate goal of the Lehrstück. This aim is reached by means of ever new iteration of scenes and storylines according to the rules of the model mentioned before. Thus, seemingly immobile positions are set into motion and are brought into connection with those I am in play with. Thus, identity narrative, that's my story. I am identical to myself, immovable, irreversible, function as material for scenes and alternative plot lines. They become set pieces which can be reassembled with the fragments of the histories of the other strangers. Theater on the raft of the Medusa as interaction among strangers in motion. That is the nucleus of a transcultural theater. It bears witness to a mobility of aesthetics as well to an aesthetic of mobility. Thank you very much.